Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ILTA Physics Online. Today, we're going to study one of the most basic and important topics in physics, kinematics. Kinematics is a branch of classical physics that describes and explains the motion of objects. Through today's lecture, we will build a systematic understanding of motion, and we'll briefly look at the four types of motion that we'll be studying later on. And we will also introduce the motion diagram using a particle model, which is a physics tool used to describe and represent motion. Don't think of it as something too difficult or overwhelming. It's really about concepts you're already familiar with in everyday life, like position, distance, speed, and acceleration. All right then, let's all get moving. Okay, what is kinematics? As I mentioned earlier, kinematics is the study of the motion of objects, but saying that we study the motion of objects may sound a little abstract. More specifically, kinematics is about describing where an object is, how fast it moves, and in what direction it moves as time goes by. At this point, notice that in kinematics we do not deal with the causes of motion, such as forces or energy. We simply assume that the object moves, for whatever reason, and focus only on the motion itself. The study of how forces or energy cause motion is called kinetics. The two names sound similar, right? We'll briefly summarize the difference between kinematics and kinetics again at the end of today's lecture. Let's quickly recap what we'll be studying next. At the high school level, we'll study kinematics by describing and explaining motion in terms of three main parameters: displacement or position, velocity, and acceleration. Now, when you think about the motion of an object, what's usually the first thing that comes to mind? Yes, it's how fast the object is moving. That's what we call speed or velocity. In everyday life, people often use speed and velocity as if they were the same thing. But in physics, we make a clear distinction. Speed is a scalar quantity, while velocity is a vector. We'll go into the details later on. Another important question we often ask about motion is, where did the object move from and where did it move to? More precisely, we are interested in the initial position and the final position and the change between them. The word we use for location is simply position. The change in position is called displacement. Sometimes we may also care about the total path length and object traveled, and that's called distance. So we already have several different terms related to location of an object: position, displacement, and distance. In physics, we'll learn to carefully distinguish these concepts, and we'll also learn how to express them mathematically, so-called formulas, using the language of math. Don't worry if it feels confusing right now. For today, just think of this as a preview or a sneak peek and get familiar with the names. We'll go step by step and organize these concepts more clearly later. Finally, when we think about motion, we can also imagine cases where the speed gradually increases or decreases over time. For example, think of a car starting from rest and slowly gaining speed as it moves forward. This kind of change in velocity is described by the term acceleration. So here we have four important physical quantities: time, velocity, displacement, and acceleration. These are the key motion parameters, or kinematic variables, that we'll use to describe motion. In short, kinematics is the branch of classical physics that explains the motion of objects by relating position or displacement over time with velocity and acceleration. Here's a fun fact that won't be on the test. The word kinematics comes from the ancient Greek word kinema, which means movement. It shares the same root as the word cinema, meaning motion pictures. So in a way, watching a movie is technically studying the motion of objects. Now let's dive into the world of kinematics, which can be just as exciting as a movie. Let's talk about motion. Earlier, I said that our goal is to describe or explain motion. So, what exactly does physics mean by motion? In physics, motion is defined as a change in an object's position with respect to time. The path of this motion is called a trajectory. In real life, there are many different kinds of motion. But in high school physics, we usually classify motion into four types. We'll study each type in detail later, but for now, let's just get a simple conceptual understanding of them. It's also a sneak peek of our movie. The first type is straight line motion, also called one-dimensional motion. A train moving along a track is the most intuitive example. The object can move forward or backward. This is the simplest type of motion, and that's where we'll begin our study. The second type is projectile motion, which is a kind of two-dimensional motion. In general, two-dimensional motion could mean an object moving freely in any direction on a two-dimensional plane. That's complicated, so in high school physics, we focus only on a special case: motion that is determined by gravity, the gravitational force. For example, the parabolic path of a basketball when it's thrown toward the hoop is a typical example of projectile motion. The third type is circular motion, where an object moves along a circular path around a central point. You might picture a motorcycle moving around a circular track. The fourth type is rotational motion, where an object spins around itself. Think of a spinning top rotating in place. These are the four types of motion we'll study throughout this semester. So as we've emphasized, our main interest is motion itself. I know I've been saying motion, motion, motion over and over. It might even feel a bit tiring. But yes, we'll keep moving forward. So how can we actually describe or explain the motion of an object? There's a subtle difference between describing and explaining. To describe motion means to state what you see in measurable terms. For example, the car is moving to the right at 30 meters per second. To explain motion, on the other hand, means to include causes or consequences. For example, the car is moving to the right at 30 meters per second, but when the brakes are applied, it stops after 5 seconds. That's the way I personally think of the difference. Now, let's go back to the textbook and introduce one very useful way of describing motion visually and intuitively. It's called a motion diagram. A motion diagram is like a sequence of snapshots showing an object's position at equal time intervals. For example, it's like taking a series of photos of a moving object every second. Motion diagrams help us visualize and represent motion very effectively. Here's a famous historical photo called a stroboscopic photo, taken in 1949. It shows a person swinging a tennis racket, captured at very short, equal time intervals. By looking at the photo, you can clearly see the trajectory of the swing. This kind of information can be very useful in sports science, such as correcting a player's form. So, motion diagrams are a powerful way to visually and intuitively describe motion. Now let's look at some examples of motion diagrams. Here we have motion diagrams of different kinds of motion taken at equal time intervals. Let's describe them one by one. In the first diagram, you see a person on a skateboard photographed at 1-second intervals. The positions are evenly spaced, meaning the person is moving at a constant speed. In the second diagram, you see a person starting to run from rest, also photographed at 1-second intervals. Here, the positions get farther apart each time. This means the person is speeding up, an acceleration. In the third diagram, you see a car slowing down to a stop. The positions get closer together each time, showing that the speed is decreasing. From these three examples, we see that motion diagrams alone can tell us whether an object is moving at a constant speed, speeding up, or slowing down. The last example shows the path of a basketball traveling toward the hoop. From the motion diagram, we see that the ball is moving at roughly constant speed since the positions are almost evenly spaced. But notice something else. The motion diagram also shows the trajectory, the path of the ball. We can see that the ball rises upward and then falls back down. So motion diagrams don't just show speed, they also show direction of motion in a very intuitive way. This is the advantage of using motion diagrams. They let us see both speed and direction in a simple, visual form. We'll use them throughout our study of motion. While motion diagrams are very useful, drawing detailed pictures of people or cars every time would be inconvenient. So in physics, we often simplify things using something called the particle model. In the particle model, we represent an object as a single point, concentrating all of its mass at that point. For example, instead of drawing a runner's full body, we simply mark their position with a dot, a single point. This makes it much easier to represent motion clearly. In this model, the runner's positions are shown as dots, and you can still tell that the runner is speeding up because the dots get farther apart as time goes on. But there's one problem with the particle model: it's harder to tell the direction of motion. That's why we add labels like 0, 1, 2, 3 to show the sequence of times, or sometimes arrows to show direction. These arrows later develop into velocity vectors, which we'll study in detail later. So from now on, we'll represent motion using motion diagrams based on the particle model. This will be the standard way we describe motion in this course. As a side note, physics also uses something called the rigid body model, which we'll study when we get to rotational motion. But for now, just remember the name. It'll be helpful later when we revisit it. Now, let's wrap things up. Earlier, I said we'd briefly review the difference between kinematics and kinetics. Kinematics, as we've studied today, is the field of physics that describes motion itself, relationships involving speed, direction, acceleration, and so on. Kinetics, on the other hand, studies the causes of motion, mainly forces, and relates them to the resulting motion. This is where famous physics laws like Newton's laws of motion, conservation of momentum, and the work-energy relationship belong. Together, kinematics and kinetics make up the larger field of dynamics in classical physics. It's not essential to worry too much about the distinctions right now, but that's the general idea. So today, we've learned what motion is, looked at the 4 basic types of motion, and explored motion diagrams and the particle model as ways of representing motion. Did you notice something interesting? Up to this point, we haven't used a single math formula or even a number. Yet, I think you're starting to get an intuitive understanding of motion. That's the point. Physics isn't about calculation, it's about understanding. Once you truly understand the concepts, then math is just a tool to express that understanding quantitatively. So let's focus first on understanding, and leave the heavy lifting in calculation to your calculators. We've talked a lot about motion today. To end, let's watch a short video clip as a fun way to keep moving forward with our study of motion. Thanks for your effort today, and see you next time.